Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our webinar. Thank you. Protecting Textiles, Disaster Preparedness Heritage Collections. I am Alicia Nottingham, Assistant Library Conservator at the Preservation and Conservation Laboratory, Heritage Library Division, NALIS. We ask as you keep your cameras off and your mics muted, you are invited to type your questions into the chat for the question and answer segment at the end of this webinar. Let me introduce our organization. The National Library and Information System Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, NALIS, is the country's coordinator of all library and information services. Beyond the Heritage Library, there are over 25 public libraries, 3 libraries and correctional institutions, libraries in secondary and primary schools, and special libraries in several government agencies, all administered by NALIS. Please visit our website, www.nalis.gov.tt, for more information about our services. We post a link in the chat of this webinar. One of NALIS's key responsibilities is to promote and preserve national heritage information. The Heritage Library Division, located on the 2nd floor of the National Library Building, Port of Spain, Trinidad, helps NALIS fulfill the goal of acquiring, promoting, and preserving national heritage information. Special collections acquired or donated to the Heritage Library Division consist mainly of traditional library items created by or of interest to a significant person or organization of Trinidad and Tobago. I invite you to follow the Heritage Library Division on Facebook at nalishld.tt. See the link in the chat. The Preservation and Conservation Laboratory is responsible for ensuring the overall longevity of library materials, with special attention to the Heritage Library Division and its collections of historical importance. The PSC Laboratory, which was officially commissioned in 2013, helps NALIS fulfill the role as the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, Preservation and Conservation, or IFLA PSC, Regional Center for the English-speaking Caribbean. NALIS is a part of the network of 16 IFLA PSC centers around the globe with the aim of providing knowledge and expert advice on the preservation and conservation practices within their region, and to serve as IFLA's key area of work on safeguarding and promoting culture and heritage. We've continued our mission of raising awareness of preservation and conservation issues through our preservation webinar series. In case you missed any of our previous webinars or previous seasons of the series, check out the YouTube playlist on the NALIS channel. This webinar is yet another opportunity to foster partnership between the British Library and NALIS Trinidad and Tobago. Back in 2016, one of our librarians was a recipient of the Friends of the British Library Preventive Conservation Voluntary Work Opportunity. For a 3-month period, Camille George, Librarian 3, Heritage Library Division, worked alongside the British Library Preventive Conservation team and their colleagues in conservation science, curatorial departments, reading rooms, and imaging services. In fact, it was during this time that Camille met today's facilitators, Liz, Rose, and Sarah Hamlyn. In 2022, Liz facilitated the webinar Caring for Textiles, and we are excited that she agreed to return with her colleague for today's webinar, Protecting Textiles. Let me introduce our facilitators. Sarah studied graphic design before completing a 3-year conservation traineeship at the British Library. She worked as a paper conservator for 8 years before moving into collection care, working on a wide range of projects involving the storage, movement, use, and display of collections. While working, Sarah gained an MA in Preventive Conservation from Northumbria University and became accredited with the ICON, the Institute of Conservation. Sarah is currently lead Preventive Conservator at the British Library, where she is responsible for teams that deliver collection care policies and procedures and training for disaster preparedness, collection care awareness, environmental monitoring, integrated pest management, and housekeeping across both sides in London and West Yorkshire. Liz has been a Textile Conservator at the British Library since 2015. She completed her Master's in Arts in Textile Conservation at the University of Southampton in 2009 and initially worked as a freelance textile conservator, then with the Imperial War Museum, London, and then finally at the British Library. I know Liz is excited to share about her journey into textile conservation and about her work at the British Library. Over to you, Liz and Sarah.
Hello. Nice to see you all today. I'm just going to share. I'm going to start the presentation. I'm Sarah, and then Liz is going to talk about her bit as well afterwards. Yeah. And we're both going to chip in if we misremember anything. So firstly, thank you for that introduction, Alicia. I'm very proud of our connections with NALIS, and it's very nice to be here with you today because I know disaster preparedness is something that you've focused on a lot in previous seminars. So yes, just going to start with an overview of the collection at the British Library and our approach. So starting initially with our users, we, like many heritage organisations, are meeting our users' needs. Our users are very diverse. They have different needs. Some of them may be doing research. Some of them may be doing personal research, personal history. They may be coming to see an exhibition. They may be coming to catch up and have a work meeting. And they may be accessing our collections in different ways through educational programmes and show and tells. And so one of the things, the challenge we all face working in this kind of environment is how do we meet current user needs, but how do we also preserve our collection and ensure it's available for users in the future? And to do that, we try and balance risks as much as possible. The British Library collection comprises over 170 million items. It's a growing collection. So while there are historical collections formed when the library came together in 1972, from smaller different libraries that came together and also different collections that came together. So it's quite diverse. We continue to acquire new material, and it's been estimated that equates to 13 linear kilometres of new physical collections each year. And it's very diverse. While we're a library and we have a huge amount of lending material on one of our sites and also legal deposit material. So a lot of books and periodicals and newspapers. We also have objects, artifacts, manuscripts, modern material, and these are just some of the items that you can see on screen that we have in the collection. In the top centre actually is one of our textile items, which is a panoramic view of Kashmir painted on cotton, which dates from the 1850s to 60s. Our collections and our activities are based on two sites. We have the site that we're both sitting in today, which is in London, which is the building on the left, which is a purpose-built building. It's the largest public building built in the United Kingdom in the 20th century. It's very much an outward-facing building, so we have 11 reading rooms split between special collections and general collections, and it's also where we have the bulk of our exhibitions and displays and events. It was designed at a time when we knew what a lot of the risks were, so the building has lots of things within it to minimise risk to collections, including full air conditioning, no horizontal pipe work, good storage environments and conditions. Our site in Boston Spa in West Yorkshire is 200 miles away from us. It's a very different site. It's semi-rural, it's 42 acres, and it was originally built in the Second World War as an armament factory. And the buildings that you can see, the single-storey buildings with the white roofs, are some of the original buildings that still exist. It's gradually been built over time. The library was first based there in the 1950s as part of the Library of Science and Technology, and we have built increasingly on this site, and it's our main storage location. In terms of some of the storage in London, on the left you can see some of our mobile shelving. In London, we tend to store the special collections, our heritage collections, and also modern collections that are highly used. So on the left, you can see some of the storage in the basements, which are all underneath the piazza in the photograph that I showed you. We also have site-specific artwork, so you can see a Patrick Caulfield tapestry in our conference centre in the middle top. And in Brindle Bottom is something Liz has actually acquired.
Yeah, so I'll just interject because I do talk about this later. This is the largest cupboard I have ever seen. It was purchased to store 2 flags that I did the treatment on, and the boards that the flags are now on are 2 meters wide by 2 meters 10. And I'll show you them when I start talking, but that is the most enormous cupboard I've ever seen.
And on the right is a photograph of the King's Library Tower. So this is in the centre of our entrance hall in our site in London. It's actually 2 layers on each floor of shelving, and it is houses our founding collections, which were originally in the British Museum, and is materials retrieved from there every day. So it's a working library. The site of Boston's Borough is different. As I said, we have 80% of the collections there. Thinking about textiles, we don't have as many items there, but we have pockets. So we have textiles within the Punch archive and the India Office collection. So furniture in the India Office collection and full-size Mr. Punch outfits, including pants and shoes, in the Mr. Punch archive. And we do have textile books for children and things like that on site. So thinking about how we actually approach how we care for the collections, and I know this is something that some of you will be very familiar with and have seen previous webinars that you've done. We base our approach around the 10 agents of deterioration, which was originally developed in Canada by the Canadian Natural History Museum. The reason we like it is it's scalable. It's also understandable if we need to talk to stakeholders. And I tend to divide it into 3 sections. So we have the environment in which we store, use and display items. So looking at light levels, temperature, relative humidity, contaminants. We have the things connected with use and physical movement of items. So handling, accidents, thieves and vandals, and also dissociation, which used to be called custodial neglect. And really relates to the information and the integrity of the items within your collection. And the easiest way I can describe it is having a photo album where you know you've got 20 photographs, but you don't know what those items are. So you don't have that item level information. So if something went missing, you wouldn't know what it was. But it could also be as simple as putting something in a box with the wrong identifying mark in it. But what we're kind of focusing on today are the things that we tend to think of as disasters and emergencies. We're not talking about pests so much, but really focusing on things like fire, water, accidents that happen, leaks, building problems, things like that, things that we would constitute as disasters or emergency situations. So thinking about textiles, and I mean, we're all wearing clothing, we're all very familiar with textiles. It's inherently, they are very flexible, quite unwieldy in the sense they are not as rigid as other items. And so they are vulnerable in all sorts of situations, normal situations. And Liz will pick that up in terms of the work that she does. They can also vary in size. So their natural state, I think, is to be vulnerable to damage compared to some more robust items. But in an emergency, they are particularly vulnerable. If there are dyes within textiles, they can bleed when they're wet. Liquids, so water, but also if fires are being put out with foam or water, they can also contain additives. If there's debris, that can be washed through textiles, causing staining. And you can also get associated dust, debris and soot, which can cause damage. The image that you can see on the right is actually a textile that was stored underneath the bed in a historic house just outside London, which had a fire in 2015. The 3-storey house was actually gutted, so effectively there are no floors at the moment. They're involved in the restoration process. But unbelievably, this item was retrieved from under a bed and is undergoing conservation at the National Trust. While you can see deposits and debris on the surface, the bigger problem is thought to be the staining in the item as well, as far as conservation goes. Textiles can be additionally vulnerable if they have additional elements to them. So, for example, we have a tapestry that has tassels attached to it, but also beading, all kinds of threads and things like that, which you'll pick up as well. And also, if they are already damaged or degraded, that can add an additional layer of risk. One of the biggest issues, particularly if things get wet, is that they can increase in weight and size and become even more difficult to handle. So there's a risk of straining or tearing or splitting if things aren't supported. Textiles are very amenable to getting very wet very quickly. As an experiment, I took a cotton rug, 100% cotton rug at home, just put it in a bath with a little bit of water, allowed it to soak in, and it increased before it was 1.1 kilos. Afterwards, it was 3.7 kilos. So it changed from something that I could easily hold in one hand to something that I needed to hold with 2 hands, and also be very mindful about whether I was moving water or depositing water when I moved it. The other risk that I know a lot of us are aware of is the risk of mould forming if items are allowed to remain damp for any period of time without action. So again, I know this is something that's been covered in previous seminars, so I will just explain quickly that, like many people, we follow the risk disaster preparedness cycle. So ahead of time, trying to prevent incidents occurring and think about what might happen and put yourself in the best position to prepare for them. After an event, we're looking to do that so that we can respond more effectively and ultimately recover. And the reason we do that is there is a lot of evidence that while salvage incidents and emergencies are very personal and very individual to even people in a domestic setting when they happen, we can all probably point to incidents where there has been a flood or a leak or a fire. So in some ways they are very common incidents. And we know that planning and thinking in advance just means that we can respond far more effectively and recover better. It also makes it easier for people in terms of decision making, but it's not a one-stage process. It is a cycle. It's something you need to review. Things change, things get updated, staff move on. So it's a continuous process of looking at it and reviewing the context in which we're all operating in. So in terms of risks, thinking about what might happen, and that could be as easy. In our case, I've recently completed an exercise to go back and look at, I'm lucky enough to have 30 years worth of incident reports and data from this site, slightly less from our other site, but going back and seeing where the common themes were, where we were having repeat problems. There are some things we might know. So if we have maintenance, for example, we're very aware of needing to plan for that and put things in place. And that's part of identifying steps that can be taken to reduce or eliminate risks. We have disaster plans, but we will occasionally revisit them or come up with something for a different activity. And we will also look at whether we need support from other people, so whether it's something we can manage in-house or we do need to get support or training or something else to support our activities. That then means we're in a better position to understand what our specific risks are and what could happen. Actually put some of those plans in place to eliminate risks, carry out routine checks and maintenance, and that's becoming a big issue in terms of climate change and changing climate for us, and particularly on our site in West Yorkshire, where some of the buildings are older, for example. But here as well, there are different risks, but still needs addressing. identifying priorities in an emergency and carrying out training and raising awareness. So that's within collection management, where Liz and I work in conservation, or with other stakeholders. So the photographs you can see on the right are us working with the estates and facilities team to protect some collections when we were going to do some maintenance in this area. In the middle is a colleague helping me to set up a salvage training session for people newly joining our team. And bottom right is an exercise I did to actually get the salvage team to help me restock the trolleys, as well as helping me to do that as an activity. It also meant they were familiar with the contents of the trolleys. We do have an emergency response team, and so we have taken all of those bits of activity over time, all of those bits of information, and we have our emergency response plan actually in a Teams. So it can be accessed on work phones and personal devices if people are happy to do that. I worked with a colleague to review the information. So rather than have a long form document, we have 3 different documents that pull together different information in small bite-sized chunks. Initially, you'd want to know the procedures ahead of time, ahead of an incident, to understand your responsibilities. Orientation if you're called out and you need to know where equipment is, what equipment there is, and salvage, lastly, if you do need to do some practical recovery. On the right, I've got some of the resources. So we have pre-printed stickers, which helps us triage material. So if we needed to send something to conservation, and easily separating out material that needs to be frozen or air dried. We also have one for mould, which we also use more widely in our activities. And on the right is a quick reference guide, a checklist that people can refer to if they're called out. And it acts as a prompt. Anyone who's been involved in an emergency situation will know there's a lot of thoughts going through your head, your heart is racing. So it's a prompt and a support to help you and guide you and to remind you of the things that you need to do. We occasionally do targeted training. So this is an exercise we did with the team, protecting it's actually a prop. It's used in a modern exhibition that we had, but setting it up as if it were a collection item with some protective material rolled on top. And we asked the teams to actually work out how they would protect it, and then also then how they would remove it. And Liz and I are working on a session for the salvage team later in the year when I've recruited some new team members where we'll be doing more around textiles. Identifying priorities is very important and very difficult. And it does depend on the size of your organisation, or at home if you're domestic, in your own domestic setting. So there's no ideal number, but it is important to do. It helps you to assess whether items are at risk or have been damaged if there's an incident, or know whether there are priorities in the area affected. It helps you identify items that might need to be protected where they are or removed. How you choose and what you choose to be your priorities is a very personal, individual organisation. We look at significance, so that's not just financial value, it could be historical, cultural, it could be place-specific. We look at items that are vulnerable because of their format and condition, and also ownership. So, for example, items that we have on loan. We use grab sheets. Liz is going to talk about that later. And part of the reason for doing that is it does help in an emergency. So the salvage team, people in the library might know what items look like, but if you're dealing with the emergency services, it helps to give them an image so that they've got something to understand what they're looking for and give guidance about what they're supposed to do with it. I've just added some resources there. There are quite a lot of guides freely available and information available out there. I'm particularly focused on the ones that have included textiles. I think the key thing with using resources is having looked at your risks, your context. The way that I approach this is seeing whether they help or add, or how we can apply them within our own situation. And I think that's the really important thing. One size will not necessarily fit all. So recommendations might be very good, but if it's not something that you can implement or we can implement at the library, then I will look for a workaround. In terms of, this is another thing in terms of thinking about the equipment that you have. So historically, because we are a library, the kit that we had originally, that was first collected over 30 years ago when we moved into this building, or were planning to move into this building, was very much focused on salvaging books, periodicals and newspapers. And over time, as there's been more awareness of other items in the collection, or we are borrowing or displaying or using different objects in the collection, we have looked for gaps to try and see where we might need to supplement equipment. So aside from the general supplies and the fundamental things needed to support people and protect people, specifically for textiles, the things that we found helpful are gloves, stiff supports to place underneath textiles, and that could be as simple as a tray or a board. Containers for small items, because the small items are particularly at risk of loss during the commotion of an incident. Plastic sheeting, absorbent materials, and I think we're having this discussion of deciding that the old bed sheets are definitely
white cotton bed sheets, very absorbent if you're lucky enough to have some.
Enough people to move things, and also equipment, particularly if you need to reach things at height, and that's something Liz will pick up on. Just very quickly, so the reason we do that is having that sense hopefully puts us in a position where we've got response plans and resources which are flexible and helpful and support people. People know what they're doing. They know whether they can make decisions themselves or whether they need to escalate, and if so, who they need to get assistance from. And also, importantly, for anyone who manages salvage teams or equipment, hopefully we don't have incidents, but when we do, we need to make sure our equipment is working and accessible. So again, we've recently done a big piece maintaining and making sure that everything's up to date. So bringing that back again to what does that mean in terms of textiles, looking at how we approach things. Often some of the things in here are going to be things that would apply for other collection formats as well, or materials, in terms of we want to protect items from damage. So if we've had an incident, we may know that things have been damaged, but our initial priority is to check that nothing else is going to be damaged, or to limit the spread of that damage, or also to limit spread to another area where there may be higher priorities. We want to identify and then triage things that are damaged. Specifically thinking about textiles, we want to be very mindful of that transfer of dyes, debris, dirt from one item to another. So aside from looking at whether things are wet or dry, we would also be doing that additional triaging to make sure that we are separating them. And because of their fragility, we'll be looking to limit handling to remove them. This is something we've been working on recently to protect items in situ. So I mentioned looking back at previous incidents, and it's fair to say that most of ours over the years have involved water, not necessarily big incidents, but small incidents are also disruptive. And so we decided to pull together some leak response kits. As part of that, we measured the shelving with enough of an overhang, and inspired by some maintenance where we saw and discussed using magnets to protect items and hold sheeting in place because it was easy to take them off and adjust them. We tried this approach and we were able to put the sheeting up in a minute, less than a minute, across this whole range. And the way that we did it was by working out the most effective way of folding the sheets, so that you could just, one person could drop it down the entire length and then you can spread it out. So anyone who's ever used a roll of sheeting, a plastic sheeting, they're often folded in the middle. So your first task is often to fight with the plastic. While it took us time to actually do the folding, we've got this down to quite a quick method now. So we can just gradually in the background pre-prepare some plastic sheeting. The image on the right is actually a photograph from the US National Park Service, and this is a good example of moving items. So again, I mentioned a rigid sheet, rigid surface. In this case, there's a sheet of plastic. You could also use dust sheets, but you'll have enough people and you're supporting items so that they're not actually taking the weight themselves. In common with things like books, for example, if those are damaged, or archives, we wouldn't be wanting to unroll or unfold or separate items. We'd do that at a later stage. Because of the vulnerability, we wouldn't want to stack textiles on top of each other, and that means you may need more space to actually triage and separate out material than you might otherwise. We would look at blotting, but not wringing out. And we'd be wanting to use an absorbent cloth. But what we wouldn't try to do is remove any marks or soot or debris from items that are damp or wet. The ideal would be that if things were wet, you'd be looking, or slightly damp, you'd be looking to air dry them. On the bottom right, you can see we do have an area set aside for wind tunnels, and we normally have Corex rigid sheeting over that so that we create a tunnel and then fans creating a sort of consistent airflow. We wouldn't want to do that with textiles, which are much more vulnerable. In the photo, we were actually more gently air drying some audio discs that had been affected by a leak. So we would use a similar type of approach in our context, making sure we've got good airflow and checking frequently. If we had large numbers of items, or we had things that we weren't confident that we could dry fully in 48 hours, we would look at freezing. Again, a slight difference from how we would approach textiles to books. We would be far more mindful of metal components and embellishments and things like that, and the need to protect those. So that's an example where we might want to prioritise those items to go to conservation, and we can contact Liz. And we'd always wrap things before freezing and sealing with tape. We are very lucky because Liz works here. We have that advice on tap. But if we didn't, I would approach a Textile Conservator for advice if I worked in another institution or environment. At that point, I'm going to hand over to Liz.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to start and tell you a bit about the British Library collections of textiles. The main collections in the library are split into these four areas: Asian, Africa, Contemporary British, including the Sound and Vision Archive, European and American collections, and Western Heritage. And almost every one of those collection areas has textiles in it. We have, I don't know the exact number of curators, but there's well over 100 curators here at the library, and each one of those areas is subdivided many times. So the collection is enormous, but the collection of textiles grows on a daily basis, and hardly ever a day goes by that I don't find a new textile. And that happened this morning. I saw one up from the India Office Library that I've never seen before. So some days are more exciting than others. So this is a range of textiles. The gentleman on the left is a Canadian comedian who lives near the library. He's called Tony Law, and he has given the library his archive. And in his archive is that headband that I need to put in a new storage box, but I haven't done it yet, so it's on my list. Another item I need to work on is this very large archaeological textile. It can't be used. It's stored in plate glass, sandwiched between 2-inch thick pieces of glass. It needs to be rehoused so it can be used in the reading rooms. It's very rare. It has been imaged. It is on the International Dunhuang website, which can be accessed freely for research and just if you're interested. And the image below, I think, is a World War I or II textile with many languages. It is an embroidery, and all of those items I've still yet to work on. As Alicia said, I started in 2015. That is 10 years ago in January, and I haven't accomplished many of the tasks that I hope to do. So here are some textiles that I have again encountered, but these ones are after conservation. So the one on the left is a Torah mantle. Torah mantles are used to cover the Torah scrolls. This piece was in terribly bad condition. The textile was completely fragmented, and I worked on that, and that is now stored in a new box and supported within the storage without the scrolls inside. The little dolls at the top, these ones, this was a gift to the library. They are part of the D'Oyly Carte archive, which is the Gilbert and Sullivan archive. They are representative of characters in I think, the Pirates of Penzance, the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, and they are absolutely stunningly made. Not by a lady who did them because she was interested in the costumes and interested in D'Oyly Carte. And the big cupboard that Sarah showed you earlier is to house these two items, and these are the two flags that I came in to treat first of all in 2015. They didn't look like flags when I first saw them, but happily they look like flags again. We also have textiles on open display, as Sarah mentioned in the beginning. This is an enormous textile, a tapestry that's site-specific for the British Library in London. It hangs in the foyer of the library. Prior to me coming here, and I was very glad it was prior to me coming here, this tapestry was taken down, and for surface cleaning because it was very dusty, and also they wanted to test the colour of the wool on the back to see how much the lighters had affected it, but also I think they put on a new lining as well. When they first put up the scaffolding, which you can see on the right hand side, it wasn't fit for purpose. It was tested, it was a bit too wobbly, so no members of staff went up there. They had to take it down and they had to re-erect it. So it was safe for the staff to go up, and it was safe for the tapestry to come down. It then came down again, the tapestry went away, it came back, and then they had to rebuild it. It was an enormous cost. I can't quite remember how much I was told, but so you can also encounter textiles in the reading rooms. So these two examples here are embroidered books. We have a large collection of embroidered books. And I started working when I first got to the library, and I didn't have quite enough to do. I visited one of the basements where the embroidered books are kept. And this is the condition they were kept in. So they were housed in sort of old Victorian looking boxes, highly acidic environments. The boxes didn't fit. You had to dig the items out of the box to get them out. They're beautiful boxes. They look like books. They have leather spines, and they look like a book that you would like to stand on your bookshelf, but they're really not fit for purpose. So I started looking at new storage options, and this was the beginning of my new storage option. And this little book was actually going out to an exhibition, so I made a plinth for it. Oops, sorry. And I surrounded the plinth with the book in the middle and with foam around, cut to size, and the foam encases the book. So we've now adopted this as our, well, without the silk plinth, because that was for display. So I've emulated that initial solution with plastisode, which is the foam that we use. It's an inert foam. It's very safe. We now wrap the embroidered books in an inert polyester, and every time one of these books is rehoused, we provide packing and repacking instructions within the new box. And and these boxes are very safe. So if the boxes are dropped, nothing will come out of them. There was an incident in a reading room where one of the embroidered bindings was dropped. It was in an old-fashioned box, and the embroidered book fell out. So I feel they're much safer in these new boxes. Well, you can also see textiles at British Library Textiles in our own exhibitions. So this came in to me. I had to do quite a lot of work on it to support it for the exhibition period. So you can see here there's sort of pale red, that's a net support. This enabled me to stitch the textile onto the board, but this textile is not only textile, it is also paper with gold leaf. And so we developed I developed a board that is wholly magnetic, it's covered with material, and then we were able to double support the textile with these magnets here aren't painted, but I did paint the magnets, so sorry, very sensitive. So I painted the magnets so they would blend in with the textile. So it's really important to know how you've done things, how you would be able to support them if a disaster happened. This one, I think we felt that would have to stay in place because it was too big to take out, although it was, I think, the star item of the exhibition. Personally, I think it was the star item of the exhibition. Others might disagree. Again, we have a huge programme of outward loans. So institutions can request to borrow our items. They go all over the world. This is one I'm working on at the moment. It's a huge parchment book. It's incredibly heavy. It has metalwork you can see on the front, in all four corners and in the centre. And the mount makers that we have here developed this mount, but I felt because of the metalwork and the textile cover, which is quite degraded velvet, we needed to put some cushioning on the acrylic. So I've made a cushion, a padded board. It's a deep padded board, and a soft cushion for the top for it to rest on. And that's how it'll go out. It'll go out with instructions, so that the curator who is travelling with the item will be able to instruct the installation of that at the receiving venue. And with that will go a condition report, and that contains a unique shelf mark of the item, details of the damage. We take pictures, and which also shows brief depictions of major damage. And the item is checked when it arrives at the venue. It is checked after display, and it's checked again on its return, and any damage will be noted at each point. So again, we receive loans inwards for exhibitions. So Sarah was talking about freezing. This item, I had been and I'd checked it, and the agreement to borrow it had been signed, so it was a major part of our exhibition. When I went to pack it up, we found that it was infested with carpet beetles, and so it came into the library. It had to go straight into our quarantine room. I had to pack it for freezing, because freezing kills the pests. So it had metal buttons all down the front. So I had to isolate each of those buttons from the woolen jacket. So I had to put circles of text between the button and the jacket. And then each layer within the jacket had to be isolated, and that prevents any condensation forming during the freezing process, as it freezes and as it thaws as well. And then eventually they are, after all that's done, they are put into polythene bags and sealed and put into the freezer, which is about -17, -20 for 10 days, 2 weeks. And then we bring it out, and it has to come back up to room temperature, and then we can then work on it. So again, inward loans for exhibitions. We borrow, again, costumes. We have to ensure that the costume is supported for the duration of the display. This exhibition was on during COVID, so the display period was much longer than we initially thought. So when the exhibition closed down, we had to cover everything up with tissue, but also we had to we have conservation is quite away from the display area, so we have to ensure that these items, mannequins with the costume on, are transported in a very safe way. So I have an agreement with our post room, and I can borrow their trolleys, and we package that trolley with special foam, put the item in, and then cover it with tissue, and then we can move it safely to the display area. Again, these were loans that came in. These items were chosen prior to me seeing them. When I looked at many of them, there wasn't the ability to hang them from the ceiling. These were all, the design of the exhibition was all these banners hung from the ceiling. So we had to develop ways of attaching them to the poles that they were going to sit on, and in a very non-interventive way. So this one here, it couldn't be stitched into. We had to use magnets to support the pole sleeve on the back. And I also had to create a lining, because this banner had plaster on the reverse of it, and what we couldn't have was the plaster debris falling onto people as they walked underneath the banners. So I had to create a sort of loop at the bottom which would catch any of the debris should it decide to fall. It didn't, happily, even although it was a long and extended display period. So also many or some of the items that we borrow are very complicated. They're worth a lot of money. They are very old. So this was a installation methodology I had to write for a tapestry, an embroidery that was reputed to have been done by Mary Queen of Scots. So it's about 500 years old. So I had to detail how we would install that item. It was a very difficult installation. We didn't quite have enough space. The case was quite high. It requires an enormous amount of people, but we knew all that before we started the installation, and because we knew all that, we could create an area and space and a space that was as suitable as we could make it for the installation of that very valuable tapestry. And also for that tapestry, you can see a little tiny picture of it here. It was a salvage priority, but in this instance, because of the height of the case, and the tapestry was, or embroidery, sorry, was 2.5 meters by 3.5 meters. There isn't any way that we could have got it out if there was a disaster. So we decided, or it was decided, that it would have to stay in place, and we would cover the case up to prevent any damage happening to the item. And just to end with, this was a happy coincidence. We borrowed a flag from Polish Museum. I don't speak Polish, but I was very lucky that my colleague did, and she came and she translated for me. And it just shows some of the difficulties that you might have when you're working on exhibitions. And for me, it would have been a personal disaster if we couldn't really have communicated properly. But Ivana helped me, and all was well in the end. So that was I think we thought was worth mentioning, because we borrow things from, we send things all over the world, so we borrow things from all over the world. So very pleased to have Ivana's help. So that's Textiles for me at the British Library. So thank you very much. Have you got any questions?
Okay, before we get to our questions, I'd like you to join us for our final webinar of season 4 of our preservation webinar series, Capturing History, on Wednesday, 17th July 2024. We would like to welcome Gerardo Holder, Librarian 4, Heritage Library Division, as she provides an introduction to establishing an oral history project for your family. Thank you, and we'll take your questions now. Thank you once again, Sarah and Liz, for all your helpful information. It was very informative. Love what I saw, love the dolls, love the library with the loving all of the things that I saw in terms of the books, the textiles, I have some questions which you hope you wouldn't mind if I ask. For the damaged material, right? You all have a special area where you treat these items.
So we have some areas set aside. So we would go to them. So in terms of triage, we would go to a place of safety. We would go to the nearest place of safety, and then we do have a dedicated area where we have our freezers, we have our wind tunnels, we have our equipment, and so that is our hub. But obviously it's quite a large building, over 7 floors. And so if we were to have an incident somewhere else, we would set up a sort of area there. So we'll either use a dedicated area or we will find an area that's appropriate.
But how safe is it to handle after, let's just say, should an item become saturated with water?
So actually, the one thing I didn't mention is water, because I didn't. So there is, in terms of our general procedures, one of the first things we do if there were an incident, obviously our business continuity and disaster preparedness measures involve our security teams and our estates team as well. And depending on what's happened, it might be the emergency services in charge of the building rather than us. So our procedures sit as a subset underneath that. So the first thing will be to identify if we were able to gain access to the building, whether the incident was still ongoing, whether it was safe for us to work in the area, and that might mean whether power was on, whether we could move, whether lights were on. But part of that would be including, is the water presenting a risk to people in terms of operating in that area? Do we need to remove the water first to make it safe? But the other part of it is where is the water coming from? Because as you say, it could be the water itself is grey water, black water potentially, but also thinking about whether the collections are presenting hazards if water is travelling through it and contaminating it. So that would be part of that initial discussion before we started doing any actual practical recovery.
We have some water alarms here. So in terms of that, right?
Yeah.
Would you be able to tell immediately if there is water, if there's a leak occurring?
So one of the advantages on this site is that most of the horizontal pipework within the building runs vertically. So we have the advantage that we're not likely to have a leak from above in a storage area. We do have sprinklers in some storage areas. So effectively we would have alarms if they went off. And in terms of something happening outside that caused water ingress into the building, that would get picked up pretty quickly as well. We have so outside working hours, we have security and engineers on site at both sites, and they do walk around. So something would get spotted quite quickly. Some would be through an automatic alarm, and some would be through visual assessment.
How long would you recommend that you freeze dry for, and how long would you recommend that you keep the items frozen? See, that is fabric.
We did sort of 10 days to 2 weeks for the item that came in, but that was dry. I would have to go and have a look to see whether there's any specifications about how long would be acceptable to keep it if it's wet and then freeze it and then thaw it out. So I'll have to go and have. It depends on the situation.
On the severity.
Yeah. And we would try and take as much of the excess water out of anything if it was safe. If it was safe to do so, and it might be that you just use, as I think Sarah said that. Oh, I said I like old cotton sheets because they're very absorbent. I'm lucky enough to have some at home, but if you, and then you could sort of gently blot the items and get some of the excess water out of it. But what you can't do is wring things out, because you know,
they don't want to cause any damage.
It causes huge amounts of damage. So you've got to treat it as carefully as possible, but trying to remove some of that water that makes those textiles very heavy would be, for me, my first priority.
Okay, thank you so much, Liz. That was most informative.